Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Anxiety RX podcast. I am your host, as you probably know, Dr. Russell Kennedy, a medical doctor and neuroscientist who suffered from crippling anxiety for 30 plus years. Finally found my way out through somatic methods and other methods too, but a lot of it had to do with somatic methods. And I'm talking today with Britt Piper, who I'm really happy to be here with because I've watched her work on Instagram for a long time. She has a book called Body First Healing that I've been reading, and we're going to talk about that. Britt is a new time author. This is her first book, and she's an SCP, as I am, and an educator for a long time. Was in the sort of the science field for a long time, and then kind of like me, saw that the science has a limited. Whenever I see science-based therapy, I always go, "Oh God, here's something that'll help you cope, but won't help you heal." Welcome, Britt.
Thank you. I am really, really excited to be here. And
Yeah.
likewise, I've always followed your stuff too.
Yeah.
So excited to reconnect.
Interacted a number of times for sure.
Yeah.
So why did you write the book?
Oh man, such a simple yet such a big question.
I know.
Yeah. I wrote the book because I wanted there to be a lot of my work as a professional. I always say that my research, you probably experienced the same, started off as me search. And I'm 36 now, but my late teens and early to mid 20s was really just an absolute mess of a time. And I was in and out of traditional cognitive therapy, on the hamster wheel of medications. And I felt like I was really stuck in my life. I'd get into these cycles of, oh, I think I'm doing better. And then, no, I'm not doing better. And I had some pretty harsh wake up calls. I mean, hospital bed with alcohol poisoning. I ended up in a jail cell at one point. And so I found the most progress and the most healing when I started to focus in on the body and more specifically the nervous system. And I felt like it was a missing puzzle piece, not just for me, but also I feel like the healing and the trauma space in general. And so I'm a bit of a nerd, as you kind of mentioned, and I know you are too. And when I started to read a lot of the literature, I'm like, wow, this stuff has actually been around. Somatic experiencing was developed back in the 70s by Peter Levine, but it was really kind of these fringe modalities, alternative. But they showed incredible, and the science showed as well, incredible impact. And so I know that we've seen over maybe the past 5 years that nervous system and body-based modalities have become more mainstream. But over the past 10 years or so, I've worked to take the multitude of modalities that really supported me. And I now run a program called the Body First Healing Program. And it's a mixture of somatic experiencing, nervous system regulation and polyvagal theory, somatic attachment work, and somatic internal family systems. And so it's kind of a one-stop shop for people to really try on and see like what works for me, what lands uniquely with my healing and recovery, and what doesn't. And so I wrote a book for, I remember my publisher when I first started working with them, she said, this is the trauma book for the rest of us. So I wanted a book that was relatable, that provided the science, but didn't get too heavy in the science. So that's kind of what it is it's a blend of storytelling and my experiences, the experiences of the people that I've worked with, but there's a tried and true roadmap and a lot of applicable tools that people can use just in their everyday life.
Yeah, I think people, after a while, and you and I talked about this before we kind of went on air, they go through CBT, they go through a lot of the cognitive stuff, but the programs that really screw us up are below the level of our cognition. They're in that sort of limbic area, that sort of emotional part of our brain.
Yeah.
And we're trying to talk to the emotional part of our brain with words, and the emotional part doesn't speak in words, it speaks in the language of the body, which is feeling. So we need to change that feeling if we're going to heal, because otherwise we're going to stay in that loop that we, like you said earlier, we feel like we're getting better. We feel like we have the tools to get better. But then there's that self-reproach that like, oh, I've been through like thousands of dollars in CBT and I've done all this talk therapy and I'm not any better. In fact, sometimes we're even worse. So I think that's the thing about, I think we're starting to see more that the somatic way is something that's really helps. Like Cynthia, my wife's an SCP, and we talk about this, about how unless you have that somatic foundation, the cognitive stuff has nothing to build on, has nothing to grow into. So
Mm-hmm.
we build the cognitive place, the cognitive place second, and the body first. And that's what I really liked about the book, is it really has this sort of somatic, body-based, but then it talks about fawning. It talks about how we are in relationships and how that sort of, we perpetuate our dysfunction in our relationships. Instead of using our relationships to make ourselves better, we wind up making ourselves worse. We go into functional freeze, which I want to talk to you about. And I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah.
It's really, about how this anxiety thing that we have affects our relationships, because our relationship to ourself is really what creates anxiety in the first place. I've always said anxiety is a separation of your adult self from your child self,
Yes.
and from your mind from your body.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can join those together, then you can start to truly heal, as opposed to just cope.
Well, I don't know if you know this, Russ, and I'm not sure if I told you. You're actually quoted in the book.
Oh, okay.
I don't know
All
if I
right.
told you that.
No, I haven't
I
seen
gotta
that.
find which page it's on. But I remember I had you in our membership a couple years ago, and you led a workshop, and there was a statement that you made that just landed so well with so many people, and it was that a trigger is just an emotional age regression.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, whoa, yes, right. And that's where that parts work really comes up. And so you probably see this too. It's so interesting because people come into this work or into my program, and I was even actually the same way, which I share in the book, but people come in with, I experienced this trauma in my life at some point when I was an adult or this. And then as they start to, get into, the fun analogy, into the layers of the onion, they find that those core wounds really predate a lot of conscious memory, or, come from those developmental years. And that's why I feel like the inner child work is so incredibly important, because those first few years of life really set us on a predictable path of how our nervous system is going to develop, which then sets us up for this predictable path of how that informs our relationships to others, to the world, to ourselves, to our body. I think they say 90 to 95% of your subconscious brain is formed by the age of 3 or 4 or something like that.
I mean, 80% of brain development is before the age of 5.
Yes.
So, and then we wind up just acting it out. And I've said this on when I was on Rangan Chatterjee's podcast, is like, if you grow up in an environment of attachment and love and security, you learn that love is about connection. But if you grow up in trauma, fear, abuse, neglect, whatever, you learn that life is about protection, and your brain forms in that particular way. And this is the whole metabolic theory of healing too. And Chris Palmer talks about this, the Harvard psychiatrist, that, metabolic healing is so important because we have these pathways. And I think when you grow up in this loving, caring, attached environment, you create these primary pathways that were designed in us since, man began to be connected and loving and caring. And they're emotionally and metabolically very efficient.
Yeah.
Whereas if you learn that life is about protection, you develop all these sort of subconscious, unconscious protective patterns, which are very energy inefficient. And we wind up, creating a whole lot of stress for ourselves, just trying to stay in protection 24 hours a day.
Yeah. I like to add to that I look at it as, when we're kind of in that securely attached environment, we grow up for connection, primed for connection. If we grow up in an environment where there's a lot of chaos, we grow up with more primed for protection. And if we grow up in an environment where there's extreme trauma, distress, adversity, we grow up almost in a state of disconnection. And so I see protection as kind of like that fight or flight, that sympathetic response, anxiety, anger, lashing out. And disconnection is more so, distancing ourselves from the world, not just disconnecting from others, but also a very extreme disconnection from self, from body. So yeah, and I would say a lot of us live in those places of protection and disconnection.
I wanted to read something from your book here, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, well, I know it's not getting out till next week, so it's a bit of a thing. But this is page 149, functional freeze. Functional freeze is the state of autopilot and functional numbness. It's a blended state of both our dominant dorsal shutdown response and our non-dominant sympathetic flight response. And then on the next page, it says how it shows up in relationships. Often presents as little or no expression or emotion. Your you're neutral in all scenarios. I should need my glasses here. I'm getting old. But basically, it's really about how this functional freeze, and I know I'm like this with Cynthia sometimes, and she'll even point it out to me. It's like, you're not here with me right now. Now, the problem with that is that I start taking that as a personal insult. She knows it isn't. I know it isn't consciously, but unconsciously, where this age regression in me is, where I feel like I'm doing something wrong, or I'm not getting it, or I'm not being seen, that triggers this sympathetic response in me, in which case it drives me even further into disconnection. So that's what I think you talk about in the book, is how do we bring ourselves out of this functional freeze and into a state of connection? And we have to do it gradually.
Yes, absolutely have to do it gradually. I like to say that functional freeze is like going through the motions without emotion. And that's really that disconnection of, there's very little to no affect, very little emotion. And that was safe for us. It was safe to be guarded, to be muscled up and armored, armored up. And I would say that functional freeze shows up even outside of relationships in our everyday world in a way that's almost glamorized, when we are tough, when we can just roll with the punches, where we suck it up, we move through. And in many ways, we're finding, a lot of the science provides, or the studies provide, that emotional suppression can lead to some pretty devastating health outcomes. So yeah, it's always important to state, though, that I often like to use the analogy of the polyvagal ladder, the nervous system ladder. So for those maybe of your listeners who aren't familiar with it, it's just a really easy way to visualize the nervous system. It's a great analogy. So up at the top of this ladder, there's 3 sections. The top section is kind of like rest and digest. It's safety and connection, where we prioritize connection, as you were saying. You come down the ladder when you start to feel triggered. And here you come down into the middle section, which is sympathetic, fight or flight. We're mobilized with adrenaline, cortisol to mobilize us to fight or flee. If fighting or fleeing is not an option, or if we suppress, which we're very good at, two conscious creatures, if we suppress that anger and that fear or anxiety, we push it down, then we end up at the bottom of the ladder, where we go into a state of disconnection, which is known as dorsal shutdown, kind of like a freeze response. But here there's higher levels of epinephrine and, numbing hormones to help us to not feel. And what can happen is that if we grow up in environments, especially as children, where fighting or fleeing is not typically an option because it puts us in more danger, our nervous system is, going to end up down in that dorsal state. And if we're there chronically, that can show up in adulthood as functional freeze, feeling really disconnected from ourselves, from others, and the world. And the one thing I wanted to mention, though, why I brought up the ladder, is that people assume that regulation is being at the ladder, or being at the top of the ladder all day long. But regulation is actually being able to move up and down that ladder with flexibility. A healthy biorhythm, or a healthy nervous system, goes up and down that ladder roughly 100 times a day, which means, and that's that whole window of tolerance, riding the waves of stress, which means that there are going to be moments where we need to feel guarded in a conversation, or we need to, have a little bit of that healthy aggression to set a boundary, or we need some of that fear and that anxiety to propel us to get to that deadline. Otherwise my boss might come for me.
Totally.
Right. These things are actually healthy. Like stress in good amounts is really healthy for us. So I think that we've gotten away. I know this is totally off topic, but
no, it's great.
Important to state that being out of functional freeze or being out of these states doesn't mean that we're never going to experience it. It's about just not living there, not being there all the time.
Yeah, and I think when it gets to the bottom of the ladder, we anxious people, what we'll often do is we will dissociate into worry.
Yeah.
So, my theory, as you probably know, is that anxiety is really the state of alarm in the body. And we will do anything to avoid that state of alarm in the body, including going up into our heads and starting to machinate and worry, because temporarily, what worry does is it makes the uncertain appear more certain.
Yeah.
Even though that certainty is horrible, but in our brains, that ventral tegmental area of the brain, where it secretes dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, so we get rewarded for worry. And if the worry is particularly horrible, the brainstem will actually start secreting endorphins and enkephalins, what they call the runner's high, right? So we get neurochemically
Satisfaction.
rewarded for worried. So
Mhm.
when we hit the bottom of the ladder, it's almost like we get off the ladder and go into hell,
Yeah.
into worries of our mind. And that suspends us at the bottom part of the ladder. We don't really realize that the worries are actually hurting us.
Yeah.
Consciously, we know, but unconsciously, it's an old program. We don't know that the worries are hurting us. So we just stay suspended in the bottom part of that ladder.
Yeah.
And I think it's like that t-shirt that says, I'm in my own little world, but it's okay. They know me here. Right. So we get so
Mhm.
used to being in that place. It's familiar. And human
Yes.
beings equate familiarity with security. So if chaos was secure for you when you were a child, you will unconsciously in your adulthood seek out that. And this is where the age regression comes in. So we
Yeah.
go into this place where we are functionally 7 years old, but we feel on some level that we're still interacting with the grocery clerk. We're still,
Yeah.
living our lives. We're somewhat interacting with our spouse, but we're not really there, and they feel it. And I
Yeah.
think that's the big thing. That's what I really liked about the book, is how relational it is, like how it
Mhm.
allows you to kind of find and almost like explain to your partner, I'm in functional freeze right now. So I'm really not available to you. It's not personal to you. This is me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that, I think that's the thing, is just understanding that this is, it's just part of how you're wired and how you're built, and you can change it.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people get into this place where they feel like they're locked into that anxious realm and they can't get
Mm.
out. And they've tried all the therapies, the
Mhm.
science-based stuff, and they can't get out. So what do you say to those people?
Yeah. So, going back to what you were saying about what's familiar will always feel safe. A little tagline we like to use is "same equals safe" when it comes to the nervous
Yeah.
system, even if it's not safe for you. But you know, um, it's more so. I think in the somatic world, what we're trying to do is we are trying to get the body and the nervous system to catch up to what the mind already knows.
Mm.
In our mind, it's like my mind knows that I'm safe. My mind knows that I'm not back and I'm not at 5-year-old experience of when that happened. I know I'm at a hockey game and this is just, there's some really loud pucks being thrown on
Yep.
the ice and my sensory motor system is going crazy. But hold on a second, my body is still bracing. It's still hard for me to breathe. I'm now feeling dizzy. I'm sweating. What is going on in my body? And so in the somatic space, it's less about trying to make those experiences go away.
Mm.
Because again, we're going to go up and down that ladder all day long. It's more about how can I get better at being able to move through that experience. So I like to tell people, let's say it's anger or anxiety. It's
Mhm.
not that the anxiety is too big, it's that our capacity to be with it is too small.
Yes.
And that's something that we can control. That's something that we can change. And you do that by, you mentioned this word earlier, gently starting to touch in and notice what does that anxiety feel like in my body, right? What am I noticing? And so we start by tracking. It's called interoception, tracking. How is my body showing me that I'm anxious right now? Well, I'm feeling heat, or I'm noticing my heart rate is really increased, or oh, it's hard to breathe. And I always like to tell people, it only takes 90 seconds for your body to metabolize the charge of an emotion, the
Mm.
adrenaline and cortisol. We call that discharging. And so it's usually our fear of the emotions. It's like this, an ocean that's a mile wide, this fear. But then as
Yeah.
soon as we touch into the emotion, we find that ocean is only an inch deep,
Yep.
you know? But it's our fear. And this is kind of where interrelational focusing comes in. It's our fear of our feelings that creates more intense feelings. Or what
Yeah.
Dr. Maureen Gallagher, she often says, it's how the feeling that we have about our feelings. So if we fear our anxiety or fear our shame or fear our anger, it's just going to intensify that because you add in more adrenaline and cortisol and you increase your stress response, which then just makes the bracing or the clenching or the heart palpitations even worse.
And then
And
to interrupt
so,
just for a second, because it's so,
yeah.
so important for my audience to understand that. So when you're caught in that space, what will happen is through interoception, through that insular cortex in your brain,
Mhm.
it will relate to the prefrontal cortex and say, how do I make sense of this? And we
Yeah.
make sense of that alarm in our system by creating an alarming story. And that alarming story feeds back into the alarm in our body, which creates more alarming stories. And we get caught in this alarm anxiety loop.
Yeah.
And it regresses us back to a time where we felt, when you were saying earlier, that ocean was all of us. When we
Yeah.
were 5 and our mom was yelling at us,
Hmm.
that was all of us. There was no escape. And we didn't see what we have now, which is the ability to kind of go, oh, this is me at 5. I can bring myself into the present moment by resourcing, as you say in the book, and create this place where I'm actually safe with this and I don't have to be afraid of the feeling anymore. And I think that's how we heal from anxiety is pendulation, which you talk about as well, which we'll touch on in a minute. You go back and forth between this not, so you're not afraid of the feeling anymore. Because initially, when we're so afraid of the feeling, the only choice we had as children was to go up in our heads. And we're still doing that program even at 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. So it's learning like, okay, I can actually feel this. It's uncomfortable. I don't like it, but I can stay with it. Because every time if I feel that feeling and I run into my head, I never actually metabolize the feeling. Sorry to interrupt, but it was just so,
no, I
perfect.
love the way that you reiterated that. I often say that, you've probably heard this before, that overthinking is an underfeeling problem. Yeah. Which makes total sense, right? Because it's like we've learned to go up in our head because we're afraid of the feelings. We're afraid of what's going on. And as little humans and little bodies, we also don't have that capacity yet to be with really intense emotions. I mean, I have Lord help me. I have an almost 2-year-old and an almost 5-year-old right now. And it is just, it is emotion central over here. And they don't know how to make sense of their emotions. Right. And so, and again, it keeps bringing me back to that quote that you said, is that these are just emotional age regressions. But I also think that that's a wonderful opportunity to meet our emotions in a way that they maybe weren't witnessed before. And that's this whole concept of self-attunement. And attunement comes from attachment. Attunement is our caregiver's ability to attune to our needs, to respond to our needs in a way that regulates us, that calms us, that supports us. And so we get the ability now in adulthood, this is where a lot of that reparenting comes in, to do the same thing. And so we often want to like fix the anxiety or fix the things or make it go away.
Fight it.
Fight it.
Anxiety warriors.
Yeah. But really, I mean, and as you say, what we're doing is when we're trying to fix what's naturally happening, like there's actually nothing wrong with our nervous system and our body. It's responding in the way that it was designed and intended to do based on overwhelming experiences in the here and in the past. And so when we attune to ourselves, rather than resisting, which just creates war in our body, this tension, right? These rebound postures where we're warring with ourselves. We're offering ourselves the opportunity to be attuned to be met in the ways that we couldn't back then. And it's kind of just saying, I don't need to fix you. I don't need to make you go away, but I can be with you in this anxiety. I can be with you in this discomfort. And just that in itself can actually be incredibly powerful, because a lot of people reach out to me and they're like, what are some somatic practices you can recommend? And I'm like, it's not about the practices. Right. It's not about the tools. Because again, if your perspective is just, I want to fix, then we are always going to be throwing tools at our body, because it's never going to feel like it's okay to hold this. And then we're also never growing that capacity to be with the anxiety more and more and more.
Yeah. I mean, Gordon Neufeld, who's been my mentor in developmental psychology, he says all anxiety is separation anxiety. And he has this great term. He calls it coming alongside. Yeah. So you come alongside your child. You're not pushing them away, because basically the anxiety, the alarm, is coming from the child in you. So when you push that child away, I always draw the analogy, if a child comes up to you in a grocery store and they've lost their parents and they're crying and their hands are coming up to pick them up, do you just push them away and go, no, see you later? This is uncomfortable. I'm not going to deal with it. Of course you pick them up, but you don't do that for yourself. So this is really a lot about the inner child stuff. And, I've never really liked the inner child term. And the reason why I don't like it is because I have a lot of inner child wounding. And the people that I find that hate that inner child stuff. It's like the people that I find that hate the inner child stuff have the most inner child wounding. Yeah. So I often will use with those people younger self, like what would your younger self? So it's basically coming alongside, because it is an age regression. That alarm reaction is an age regression. So how do you come alongside that? So whenever I see fight your anxiety or anxiety warrior, it's like, no, this is the child asking for your attention. Yeah. Come alongside of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because again, the more that you war against it, the more that you're going to create, you're just creating more alarm and more threat.
Yeah.
which then just makes that younger part of you just get even louder. So yeah.
Or go into, or that younger part of you goes into functional freeze as
Mhm.
well. So
Yeah.
it's alternation between, people that have really intense anxiety. They'll go through this thing where I feel numb and I'm kind of okay, and then I go through this huge anxiety period and I'm numb, and so they're at the bottom of the ladder
Yeah.
and they're trapped there. And typically what traps them there is their thoughts,
Yeah.
because you can't escape. Like Jill Bolte Taylor does that work and says, emotions only last 90 seconds. Maybe, there's probably,
Mhm.
in a healthy nervous system who is attuned and attached, probably.
Yes.
But in those of us with trauma, we
Mhm.
suspend that. And our nervous system is so locked in protection that
Yes.
emotion lasts way longer. So
Mhm.
I've had patients who say, or clients who say to me, that whole 90-second thing, it just doesn't make sense to me because I can spend hours in
Yes.
anxiety.
Yep.
And I think that that's true for them. I think
Yeah.
that their nervous system is sort of in this functional freeze state, and it can stay there for a long time. So when I hear emotions only last 90 seconds, I kind of like, I kind of like have a
Weird.
little bit
Yeah.
of a mini seizure. It's like,
Yeah, they
in a
can.
healthy nervous system, probably.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I think the context of when you have a healthy, regulated, what we call resilient nervous system,
Which is like
one that
10% of the
naturally,
population.
yeah, I know, right.
Yeah, one
One
out of
that one
10.
that naturally, yeah, can start to pendulate on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it can take just 90 seconds. I think that context is really important. Um, you said something I wanted to add to, but it's already escaped my mind.
Oh,
I can't remember.
I'll keep reiterating. That's what I do. Basically, it really comes back to that sort of adult self, child self. It
Yeah.
really comes back to that, because that's where the child has the alarm.
Mm.
So it's finding the child, and then it's finding it in your body, and then finding the prodrome of that.
Yeah.
Because I know when Cynthia and I are about to get in a fight, we don't fight very often, but we had a few scraps in Mexico about different things, because we were both relaxed and both able to kind of, say, this is what you do that bothers me. And she used to say the first, but there is this feeling in me, and what I'll do is I'll say, I'm the problem. Like, I won't think it's
Mm.
her. I'm the problem for some. So what I do is I track. So most of my alarm, as most everybody listening on this podcast knows, is in my solar plexus.
Yeah.
Now I've tracked this place when I start getting upset with sin a little bit, and it's lower than that, and it's a tingling. It's kind of like an effervescent feeling in my belly, even before the alarm starts. So now when I feel that effervescent feeling in my tummy, I know that the alarm is coming. But
You're
now I'm in a
upstream
position.
before the
Now I'm in
waterfall.
Yeah,
Yeah.
now I'm in a position to do something about it. Because once
Yeah.
the alarm hits and once the self-reproach hits me, then I'm
You're
lost.
off to the
Like, I'm
races.
out.
Yeah.
But if I can feel the prodrome of it, and that's what I'm talking with my anxiety patients, clients, whatever you want to call them, it's like, can you find the prodrome to your alarm? Because
Yeah.
that's when we really have the most leverage, when we get a crowbar in there. And I think
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about with, on some level, with pendulation, which you talk about in the book as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I had an SE session this morning, and that was the
Your own?
takeaway. No.
Oh, okay.
In the program. Yeah.
Okay.
And in working with the client, that was the takeaway was, can we start to notice, we call it the upstream
Mm-hmm.
activation. When you start to notice it upstream before you're getting to the waterfall and it's out of control, right? And it's off to the races. What are those minute micro triggers that are starting to create this cascade? And that's the moment where you can really kind of step in. And I always say that it's not necessarily about controlling our emotions or controlling the nervous system. It's when to know when to zig and when to
Yeah.
zag. Sometimes it's about just being guided by the body and knowing that your body naturally knows what to do. I think sometimes we forget that. Again, if it's been conditioned in a state of protection
Sure.
and disconnection, it's
Yep.
going to need some work. It's going to need some support. But for the most part, your body knows what to do. So it's about learning to trust your body, but also when to guide your body, when you're starting to create new procedural patterns or impulses. So instead of, oh, I'm noticing in my solar plexus, this is happening. And when this happens, I don't know if I'm going to use this as an example. I notice when I start to feel activation in my solar plexus that, my shoulders come forward and I start to go into a bit of a collapse.
Mm-hmm.
I start to disconnect from others and I look downward. And so when we start to notice that, it's like, I wonder what it would feel like if you just visualize looking up first. Instead of allowing your eyes to look up, what would that feel like to just think about looking up? And it's like, oh, I'm noticing a little bit of some activation in my heart, but there's a part of me that wants to give it a try. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
would you be open to like looking your eyes up? And I'm going to look this way so you don't have to see me on the screen, but maybe just allowing your eyes to look up and just to see me and see what that feels like to be connected for a moment. And it's like, okay, this feels a little activating, but it feels tolerable. And so that's the moment where, again, there's a pause so that we can create a new experience. And you're creating a new impulse, a new body memory. And that's a lot of what somatic experiencing is. As you know, it's you're working with these procedural patterns that are just so impulsive, so instinctual for us and for our nervous system. And you're trying to give them a different choice, a different experience, one that you maybe couldn't do back then, but that you can do now. And so I always say that it's this new somatic experience that provides evidence to the brain and to the nervous system that, okay, I can have a different experience and one that actually was met with safety, one that wasn't too overwhelming, one that was, we could say, successful. Okay. And it's this new experience and evidence that over time, as you consistently practice this, of course, it's not a one-off thing, that then creates new expectation, where naturally your nervous system, rather than shutting down and collapsing when there's conflict or whenever your boss asks you a question, you're now noticing your posture is different. You now have more of a lifted spine rather than collapsing in the viscera and the muscles. And then, of course, that changed your postural attitude, your mindset, the stories that you're telling yourself. It's really, really, really fascinating, incredible work.
I do think there is a lock that we get into when we get into alarm. We get into this sort of, like you said, and you describe it the way that I feel it too, like your eyes go down. So when I'm walking in nature, I will naturally, if I'm having a kind of an alarm day, like they're not nearly as often as I used to get them, but I will notice that my eyes go forward and they look 3 feet ahead of me because I want to know what's going to happen. I want to predict what's going to happen. And then when I lift my eyes up, I'm able to kind of, there's a lightness to it. It's almost like I'm breaking the lock. I'm breaking the pattern. And I think that's one of the reasons why, lateral eye movements work. I think that's one of the reasons why EMDR helps a lot of people is that it breaks the pattern. It allows you to kind of go in there and give it a bit of a lobotomy in a way and change it in a way. But, that whole thing about, SE, somatic experiencing, a lot of people say this takes so long. And it does in a way. Like I will have people that I don't do pure SE, but I do a fair amount of it, especially early on with people. And it's like, well, we're not, I'm paying you a fair amount of money here and we're not really doing anything. And I tell that to people off the start, I said, we're creating a foundation here of safety. If we don't create safety in your body, anything I tell you, anything you've read in my book won't stick because it doesn't have any place. It'll just slide through like Teflon. So when you create this somatic experience, this different experience of safety, initially there's a lot of resistance to it because you didn't feel safe as a child. So it's like, how do you do this in a gradual method? And I guess I'm talking about pendulation here, which you write about in your book too, but how do you do that with your clients? Like, when they first come to see you and it's like, this is going so slowly. What do you tell them?
So I work in a bit of a different style. So I have the Body First Healing program, which I created back in 2018. And my practice, if you will, is people essentially go through the program first.
Okay.
Before doing SE work with me. And what I've found over the years is that and it's a very hands-on program. So of course there's a lot of education, but there's also the experiencing too. So for instance, it's a group program, it's 6 months, but like on Mondays, we do our nervous system gym call. So this is where we get out of the head and into the body. Yeah. And we do a lot of guided and practice facilitation or I'm sorry, not facilitation, pendulation.
Yep.
And that's what really moves the needle forward when it comes to nervous system regulation is the experiential part, because we can't tell or learn or educate our way into regulation. We have to feel and experience our way in. We have to show our nervous system. So whether that is us spending 30 minutes on doing resourcing, which can be very activating because people are like, what is safety, right? This is so foreign to me.
Right.
This week, it was working with a moment of defeat. When was a moment recently where you felt defeated? and we all tracked our postures. We thought of that moment. We started to track the posture. We did some interoception work, and then we worked with different postures and seeing how the body opened up. So, um, so not only is there the experiential part and Q&A calls, but they're learning a lot. And in the polyvagal framework, it's funny, I have it pulled up right here in my polyvagal flip chart. The three essential elements for the nervous system, the three C's are choice, connection, and context. And so kind of what you're talking about, that context, that knowing. When people start to learn about not just the nervous system, but also their nervous system, people also do their nervous system mapping in that program. There is such a weight lifted. I think people, because there's not a lot of context as to like, why am I the way that I am? And then they realize everything about me makes so much sense based on my attachment experiences, based on my developmental experiences, based on my parents' trauma. We talk a lot about intergenerational trauma. So these are all topics that we explore. So once people go through that program and they learn why it's so important to start in the shallow end of trauma, rather than being thrown into the deep end, we know how that can cause a lot more harm than be helpful. But there's actually a lot more progress that gets made. You know, Peter Levine, the developer of Somatic Experiencing, he often says that slower is actually quicker when it comes to the nervous system. So we stretch the nervous system, but we don't stress it. And what you find is that by the time, you know, people graduate my program, they'll be like, so much of my life has changed and it never felt like work, or it never felt overwhelming. And of course there are moments where it can feel like that. So yeah, I work in a bit of a different capacity. But I think that, again, what we're doing, what you spoke to, is we're helping people to create a really strong foundation for their nervous system. We're rebuilding that foundation so that if they start to do just strict SE work, they move much quicker in that process by the time we start doing sessions together.
Yeah. And I think it's understanding that, you know, your body has kind of a mind of its own, and being able to pendulate back and forth. And sometimes pendulation is like, with me, when I used to have like really severe anxiety, I would feel it. It was a hot, burning, purple, crystalline sensation that would push into my heart and push into my spine. And then it's like, okay, where in my body don't I feel this? And it may be something as numb as your elbow, right? I use elbows a lot because people just don't really feel their elbows. There's usually not a whole lot of pain in your elbow, or so it's like, where's a neutral place? Now, can we go to this neutral place? Can you put your attention into that? And then now can we go back into the alarm, and can we stay with the alarm? And I think so often we immediately, and I said this earlier, as soon as we feel even the sensation of that alarm, we're probably not even aware of it, which is the reason why most people think anxiety is in their mind. And I tell them, no, your anxiety is actually in your body. It's a state of alarm that's in your body. Your mind is just making sense of this alarm. And it's making sense of it almost always with warnings, what ifs, worst case scenarios, what I call the 3 W's of worry, which suspends you at that bottom part of the ladder. So you can't actually rise up, because your own thoughts, which you believe are keeping you safe, are actually keeping you at the bottom part of that ladder and suspended in that alarm. And you can't get out of it because you don't allow yourself to feel the alarm and go, okay, I don't like this feeling, but I can stay with it and then move into something that's safe. Because often what I'll do with people is say, what was the best time in your life? And then can we go back to that time? So what was the best time in your life, Britt?
Oh man. You know,
it's hard for us with trauma to go back.
Actually, I mean, it's probably more recent. I did have some good times growing up, despite all of the other things. But I will say it was actually probably right after my son was born. Noah was born. Well, he was born in the middle of the pandemic. So it was a really interesting time. You know, it was a time that was in some ways traumatizing, but also he was born in June of 2020. So, you know, literally middle of the pandemic. But I think being in quarantine, if you will, with him and my husband really created kind of this sanctuary for us where we were forced to slow down. And I was able to really soak in motherhood in a way that didn't feel overwhelming. I know my general I know how I am.
Yep.
With my second child, I was, back to doing work calls like a week or two postpartum, and
Sure.
my team's like, Britt, we got this. So, but being able, like being forced to really slow down and having permission to just enjoy. I actually
Mm.
look back at that time as one of my favorite times in life. His first 6 months of being alive was just really, really beautiful. We were kind of in our own little cocoon, and I really took advantage of that time. So I actually really loved that. Yeah.
Yeah. So often what I'll do is I will get people to go into that felt sense of that, which people even then resist because
Hmm.
it's like, well, this is good. And I say, okay, now you're resisting something that's really good.
Yeah.
What's behind that? What's behind?
Hmm.
It's like, well, I'm afraid it's going to get taken away. That's a huge one with people because it's like when you were a child, like my father was schizophrenic and bipolar, so he would go along fine for a while. And he was my dad was very playful, very intelligent, very fun.
Yeah.
But then he would go into these psychotic places, and I'd be like, as an 8-year-old, like, what the hell is going on here?
Right.
Right. So
Right.
after a while, I wouldn't trust. So it's that whole waiting for the other shoe to drop thing.
Yep.
So I wouldn't actually let myself feel safe because I knew the shoe was going to drop. And sometimes it would be like 6 months, 8 months, a year. So
Hmm.
I'm holding myself in this state of suspended animation,
Yeah.
waiting for it. And then when it happened, my little child mind said, see, so you
Oh,
always have
yeah.
to keep hyper
Yeah.
vigilant. So
Yeah.
when people go into this place where they actually allow themselves to feel safe, that actually creates a lot of resistance and a lot of alarm in people. So it's this really
Hmm.
this sort of unraveling and slowly sort of pulling the pieces apart slowly and
It
just getting
is.
people to understand that, okay, we can sit in our adult self and
Yeah.
we can have compassion for the younger version of us, but we
Hmm.
don't have to live there anymore, and we can bring them into the present moment. So that
Yes.
I think that's really important when it comes to that. So how is your life different now than it was at the height of your trauma and pain and fear?
Yeah. So, before we started recording, I was sharing just a little bit about, probably my most difficult season of life was
Right.
my early 20s, late teens, early 20s. My brother had just passed in a car accident. Um, I had experienced a sexual assault by a stranger who helped me change my flat tire a few years later, and went through a really grueling trial process, took 2 years.
Mm.
He was ultimately sentenced to 60 years behind bars. But during that time, the trial process was essentially postponed or continued 9 times.
Ugh.
And a lot of defense teams, they'll use that as a strategy to kind of emotionally beat down or wear down the victim so that they'll drop the charges. And
Mhm.
in my case, I didn't, but that meant that 9 times over a 2 year period, I had to kind of do like a dress rehearsal. So it was like preparing for trial with my legal team. So I had to go through the tape statements again, depositions, practice being on the witness stand. I mean, it was like exposure
Oh
therapy
yeah.
to the extreme. Plus, there was this whole anticipation of I'm going to see this man again, in the flesh, which was
Totally.
terrifying. And so that was probably the lowest point in my life, but I was incredibly dissociated. And I think that was an armor, that functional freeze,
Protection.
that
Sure.
armor for me of just going through life, but being really disconnected. And it's interesting because on the outside, we're talking about this whole glamorized being strong.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the day after the sentencing, watching the news with my parents, and there's a news anchor who's talking about me to another news anchor. They're all sitting together at their news desk, and he's saying, 20 years of covering court trials, I've never seen a rape victim who was this
Mm.
this composed, who was this strong, I'm using air quotes here,
Right. Yeah.
who was able to look her rapist in the eye, say, you did this and you're going to pay. And what people didn't know is that behind the scenes, I was at the worst point in my life. I mean,
Mm.
severe alcohol abuse, pill dependence, suicidal ideation, very extreme eating disorders. And not even 30 days after that sentencing, I ended up in a jail cell for a drunken related incident. And so, what has changed for me now is that I'm able to be with both what feels good and what doesn't feel good. I think a lot of the journey for me started with, and I remember going before the judge. I think this is probably a big part of it. I remember going before the judge. I actually had to sit in that jail cell for a couple of days. Um, And maybe I should give some context so everyone doesn't think I'm just some convict, but
I don't think people do. I don't
yeah,
think people do,
no.
but go
I
ahead.
yeah. I was out one night with my partner at the time who was drinking and driving, and I always tell people that should give you a very clear picture of like where I was at, at the time of my life. And he got pulled over, arrested, and when the police officers went to just physically pull me out of the car to give me a ride home, I went into a trauma reenactment, because I was assaulted by
Sure.
a stranger in a car. And when the assault had happened, my nervous system actually went into a fight response, but I was overpowered.
Mm,
So there was this incomplete response in my nervous system. And this anger, I used to be a very gentle natured person. I still am.
still are.
But during that 2 year period when I was drinking, I would get very angry. And it was this adrenaline and cortisol that was thwarted within, from this fight response that was thwarted within my nervous system that was trying to escape. And I'm making the image here of a pressure cooker. It's like, let this
Steam
these
up.
survival
Yeah.
hormones out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, when I was pulled out of the car, I went into a trauma reenactment. I ended up in a jail cell with 2 counts of battery on an officer with injury. And I remember in that jail cell for 3 days, that was kind of the first experience of being able, we could say, being able to be with kind of this decades old grief and experiences. Attachment wise, I was taken from my mom at birth. Because there was methamphetamine, found in our system. And I was put into foster care until she kind of got her life back on track and we were reunited. But that really set a predictable path for my nervous system. A lot of anxiety, fear of abandonment, but a lot of dissociation because my little body couldn't mount this defense of fighting or fleeing. And so I was a very emotionally disconnected girl, little girl. And so anyways, it was in this jail cell that my body was able to really start to metabolize and process. I remember sweating, shaking. I've never been through like any kind of drug withdrawal, but I tell people I would assume that's what I looked like. A lot of crying. And then I remember going before the judge for the processing a couple of days later, and she knew who I was for my sexual assault case. And she said, we're going to drop the charges, but she said, you need to learn to live with your pain better. And for me, she didn't say get past it or get over it. She said live with it.
With it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was kind of this big aha moment because most of my life I had been conditioned to just throw things under the rug or move on. I mean, my parents were back at work within a week after my brother passed away. That's just kind of how we operated. And I know that was probably helpful for some time, but we didn't really face the pain. We never really did. We just, muscled through. So all that to say, I think the turning point for me was learning how to be in my body again. That experience I had in the jail cell is where things really shifted because I remember walking out of the facility feeling different in my body. And it was hard to put into words. I remember telling people, I feel lifted. I feel lighter. I feel different. And I don't know how to explain it. And I know that was my body had released and discharged a lot of that pent up, stress hormones. And that is then what started the journey of learning about the polyvagal theory. And then I just became a nerd from there.
Oh, I bet.
That was where it all kind of started. So started working with a somatic therapist back then. They weren't a somatic experiencing practitioner, just a somatic therapist. But, my therapy sessions started to look very different than what they traditionally had. So it was like when emotions would actually emerge for the first time rather than just pushing through, it's like, yeah, can we just give some space for that? We didn't do anything with it. It was just like saying like, yeah, that's allowed to be here. And that simple step just in and of itself was really, really powerful.
Yeah. And I think, for me, because I go in, I do SE sessions about 1 a month with my therapist just to keep me, on the level. And one of the things she says that drives me nuts all the time, but she says, can we just slow this down? And it's like, I want to strangle her because it's like, oh, I know. It's because I don't want to slow it down. I'm comfortable with the speed of things.
Yeah.
And to slow things down was so uncomfortable, but it was so necessary. And maybe that was the jail cell. It was like there was no way out. Like you had no choice but to survive. And I think your survivor nature, just your spirit, Britt, I think kind of came out to support you then. And I think, a lot of us with anxiety don't believe that that spirit is in us, but it truly is.
Yeah.
And I think that's what ultimately heals us, is that spirit of, I am going to look after myself. I'm going to stop sabotaging my life. Not completely, because, it's such an ingrained part of us. I think that we kind of self-sabotage on, it's almost like a testing thing. It's almost like going up and down the ladder.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's like, okay, well, maybe I'll take this choice. And it's like, probably not the best choice for me. Less so now than certainly 10 years ago. But there was this sort of self-sabotage part of it. And then the self-sabotage part, when it gets bad, you face a choice. It's like, I'm either going to look after myself or I'm not. And
Yeah.
if your history as a child was not to look after you because your parents never showed you how, then your frustration usually comes out negatively. And
Yeah.
then you get a negative view of yourself, and the whole thing kind of, works on itself. So it's that whole groove that gets put into us, and just realizing that there is another choice. There is, and then you say that the 3 C's, like there is another choice that we can make, and choice is very empowering. And I
Yeah.
think as anxious people, or alarmed people, as I like to say, we don't give ourselves a lot of choice, and we don't realize that we have a choice. And I think
Yeah.
with you're just showing in your programs and stuff, there is a choice.
Yeah. And the kind of the tagline of SE is getting to do now what we couldn't do back then, which
Right.
oftentimes is having choice, right? Or making that different choice. And that's not to say that it's easy by any means.
Oh
It's
no.
definitely hard.
And but
Yeah.
worthwhile, and once
Absolutely.
and then I think once you start having some agency, and that's what I say about, no one's going to heal your anxiety, no
Mhm.
program, no supplement, whatever. You have to do that for yourself. And then when you start feeling that agency, that you are looking after yourself, you are looking after the younger version of you, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in itself, instead of the
Yeah.
self-defeating prophecy of the alarm, the anxiety,
Mhm.
just getting trapped in that alarm anxiety cycle over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So is there anything about the book that you wanted to talk about that we didn't touch on, Britt?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. The book is really, it is, think of it as a companion and a complement to the work that you do. Um, it's a very, when I wrote my book, I wanted it to be not all science, and I wanted it to be relatable. I wanted people to see themselves in the
Yeah.
book. And so it's kind of like half memoir, half roadmap to healing. But the first half of the book is kind of like my program. A lot of it is, the
Sure.
science, the education, and then the second half is the experiencing, the roadmaps. And really, what it explores is, think of your nervous system like armor, like a knight suit of armor, and your experiences in your early informative years, they really lay, again, the foundation and that predictable path of what armor you're going to wear, if you're going to wear this armor. And so a lot of us can get stuck armored up in these nervous system states, these survival states. We get stuck in survival mode, and it can feel like a personality that doesn't feel authentic to who we are. And there's so many conversations right now around authenticity and how do I know if I'm being my authentic
Sure.
self, and nature versus nurture. And so this book really explores that. And what it tells you is that, and we can think of anxiety in this way, is that we're not trying to do away with the armor. But what can happen over time is that you can get stuck wearing this armor even when the battle is over. And then this armor starts to become what used to start off as self-protective. It's now self-destructive because it's heavy and it's annoying and it gets in the way of everything. And you start to lose sight of who you are to this armor. You can't even find who you are anymore. And so, with that analogy, imagine that it's like we don't want to do away with the armor, but we want to slowly take off one piece at a time, slowly. I know
Yep.
this is the
Yep.
activating word
I
for
want to
all
slow
of
it
us.
down.
We
Gotta
slowly
slow it
take it
down.
off because, again, if you strip yourself of this armor, your nervous system's going to be like, what the hell is going on? This
Yeah.
is too overwhelming. And then what we do with that armor is you meld it and you melt it down into a shield. Because again, you go up and down that nervous system ladder all day long. You need this armor. This armor was once a part of you and it was here for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's more so in moments where, again, we need that healthy anxiety. We need that anger. We need a moment to be in shutdown. We need to feel dissociated for a moment. Can we have that shield available? And so again, it's not about eliminating or controlling our emotions or our very natural
Right.
experiences. It's about getting better at welcoming them, being with them, but not getting consumed by them. So,
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of meditation. When people
mm,
say, "Oh, I have a hard time meditating," my mind is always moving around. It's like that's the point.
yeah.
It's like every time you bring it back, you get this sort of like, okay, this is helpful. I
Yeah.
I can learn how to bring it back. So it's good
Mhm.
that it goes out of line, and then you get it back because then you gain confidence. Like when it goes out of line,
Yeah.
I have confidence because I've done this so many times. I've brought it back. But if every time you go into alarm, you go into your head and start to worry, you never actually metabolize the alarm. And you
Yeah.
said something earlier that really stuck with me. It's like it's learning how to feel good and not good. So
Yeah.
how did you learn that? That's what we'll
Yeah.
probably close on. It's like how did you learn how to
Yeah.
do that?
So, I think that goes back to the concept of pendulation, which maybe I don't think I described, but pendulation is your body's natural biorhythm. You can think of it as the window of tolerance, how we go up and down the ladder all day long, right? These waves of activation. But pendulation, I like to kind of imagine a grandfather clock. I love analogies, if you can't tell.
Me too.
So a grandfather clock, yeah, alarm, exactly.
Sir.
Yeah, so grandfather clock, it's like there's a moment of deactivation, which is I'm in kind of, rest and digest, and oh, now I'm activated. I'm over here in fight, flight, shut down, freeze, fawn, functional freeze. But we go back and forth that grandfather clock all day. A regulated or
Right.
a healthy system, you could say, goes back and forth. A dysregulated nervous system, one that's stuck in survival mode, it's like the grandfather clock is broken. So we're over here in activation.
Mm.
And so through somatic work, what we do is we work to first build in moments where can we start to notice something that feels good right now? Let's do some resourcing. Let's orient. Let's use our sensory motor system, which is what really communicates with the nervous system, to just explore. Can we explore the space that we're in? Can you notice the texture on the wall? Can you notice the contrast? Can you notice the shadows? I actually just took a breath as I did that. I also
Yeah.
just noticed my kids downstairs. I didn't
Oh,
realize I could hear them this whole time. Right. So, but what you're doing is you're slowing down your nervous system to
right.
take in the present. And so you're slowly kind of nudging that grandfather clock of, oh, I just experienced a little bit of safety and now come back. So we first work with the foundation of safety, teaching the nervous system how to experience safety so that it can start to naturally pendulate more. And then we also, when we are activated, can we notice that moment of activation? What does that feel like? And if it ever feels like too much or feels intolerable, then we touch back over into safety. So, healing is not just about feeling safe all the time. We hear that felt sense of safety. Like, I just need to feel safe. I've never felt safe in my life. Yes, it's about that, but it's also about getting good at being able to not feel safe.
Right.
Because that's inevitable. We're going to be triggered. We're going to be activated. Our body is always going to be reminding us of things that reminded of the past. And it's about how can I move through that in moments when that does emerge in my body without getting stuck. So, yeah, it's working with what doesn't feel good and getting better at having a capacity to be with what does feel good as well.
Yeah, I like to say when my clients say, "Oh, am I going to be anxiety free?" It's like, "No, you're not." It's not so much about feeling better. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually getting better at feeling in general. So you're
Yes.
not under feeling anymore.
Amen. Exactly.
It's a great book, Brett.
Thank
I
you.
recommend it highly. I hope to be able to keep up a conversation with you, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate you and all the work you do.
And vice versa. Thanks so much, Brett.